The autumn air felt different in Massachusetts, crisp, carrying the scent of fallen maple leaves that crunched beneath Ibrahim Traoré's polished boots as he navigated the historic campus of Westbrook University. The red brick buildings with their ivory columns stood in stark contrast to the educational institutions of Ouagadougou, where he had begun his academic journey years ago. Ibrahim adjusted the collar of his olive-green military uniform, now adorned with the diplomatic pins. That marked his transition from field commander to envoy. At 42, his face carried the weathered lines of someone who had spent too many years calculating artillery trajectories under the unforgiving Sahel sun. He was here as part of a diplomatic initiative, a leadership seminar connecting military officers turned civil servants from across Africa with American institutions. Major Traoré, a young woman in a navy blazer, approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Alicia Dawson, your liaison for the exchange program." Ibrahim nodded respectfully. "Thank you for the welcome, Ms. Dawson. Your schedule includes auditing several courses alongside your seminars," she explained as they walked toward the mathematics building. "We've arranged for you to sit in on some classes to experience American educational methods. Today, you'll observe advanced calculus with Professor Warren Harrington." Ibrahim's eyes brightened slightly. "Mathematics, this is fortunate. I studied geosciences at the University of Ouagadougou before joining the military." Alicia smiled, but there was something rehearsed in her expression. "Professor Harrington is one of our most distinguished faculty members. You'll be in capable hands." As they approached the lecture hall, the corridor filled with students rushing between classes, young faces absorbed in their phones, laptops tucked under arms, conversations about weekend plans and upcoming exams. Ibrahim felt conspicuously out of place in his uniform, drawing curious glances that quickly darted away when he returned them. "Here we are," Alicia gestured to a door with frosted glass. "I should mention that Professor Harrington can be somewhat traditional in his approach. He doesn't typically welcome auditors, but the department chair insisted." Ibrahim understood the unspoken warning. "I will observe quietly." The lecture hall was arranged in rising tiers, with about 60 students already settled into their seats. At the front, a tall man with silver hair stood writing equations on a whiteboard that spanned the entire wall. Without turning, he spoke in a voice accustomed to command. "Take your seats quickly. We have significant ground to cover today." Alicia led Ibrahim to an empty seat near the back. As they moved, Professor Harrington finally turned, his eyes narrowing at the unexpected military uniform among his sea of casual student attire. "It appears we have a visitor," he remarked, the chalk still poised between his fingers. The room fell silent. Alicia stepped forward. "Professor Harrington, this is Major Ibrahim Traoré from Burkina Faso, part of our international leadership exchange. He'll be auditing today's class." The professor's lips tightened into a thin line. "How educational for all of us." His emphasis carried a weight Ibrahim immediately recognized, the familiar tone of someone who had already formed their judgment. Ibrahim offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for allowing me to observe, Professor." "Well then," Harrington turned back to the board, "if our distinguished military guest is settled, perhaps we can return to differential equations." As Ibrahim took his seat, he felt the curious eyes of the students. A young woman with braided hair in the adjacent seat leaned over slightly. "Don't mind him," she whispered. "He treats everyone like they're interrupting his personal conversation with Leibniz." Ibrahim smiled slightly, grateful for the small act of kindness as he opened his notebook. The familiar language of mathematics filled the board, a universal dialect he had spoken since his days calculating mineral deposits in undergraduate studies, perfected through years of plotting coordinates for resource management and defense planning. In the equations flowing across the board, Ibrahim found something comfortingly familiar amid the foreignness of everything else. 3 days into his observation, Ibrahim had established a routine. He would arrive early, take his seat in the back corner, and listen attentively as Professor Harrington lectured. The material, multivariable calculus applied to physical systems, was familiar territory, though the professor's notation sometimes differed from what Ibrahim had learned at university in Ouagadougou and later applied in his military career. Ibrahim never asked questions, never interrupted. He simply observed, occasionally making notes in his small leather-bound journal. This silent presence seemed to irritate Harrington more than any disruption might have. On the fourth day, something changed. Ibrahim noticed Harrington's gaze lingering on him longer than usual, a calculating look replacing the dismissive glances of previous sessions. "Today," Harrington announced after completing a particularly dense explanation of vector fields, "we'll address a practical application. Sometimes, mathematics requires us to think beyond the textbook, to apply concepts in unexpected situations." His eyes locked directly on Ibrahim. "Major Traoré, is it? Since you've been with us for several sessions now, perhaps you might contribute to our discussion." The professor's tone carried a challenge poorly disguised as invitation. The lecture hall fell silent. Ibrahim could feel the collective tension, students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I would be honored, Professor," Ibrahim replied calmly. His French-accented English measured and precise. Harrington gestured to the board. "Excellent. Perhaps you could approach the board and demonstrate how you would solve this scenario." With swift, decisive strokes, Harrington wrote a complex differential equation on the board. Even from his seat, Ibrahim recognized it as a deliberately complicated formulation, one that combined elements from several different sections of the course, with additional variables introduced that hadn't been covered in the lectures Ibrahim had attended. "This equation," Harrington explained with barely concealed satisfaction, "represents fluid dynamics in a pressurized system with variable boundary conditions. A somewhat advanced topic, I admit, but I'm curious to see how military training in Burkina Faso approaches such problems." The emphasis on military training and Burkina Faso was subtle but unmistakable, an implication that neither could possibly prepare someone for the sophisticated mathematics of Westbrook University. The young woman with braided hair, whom Ibrahim had spoken with briefly, Aisha, he had learned, shook her head slightly, her expression a mix of embarrassment and apology. Ibrahim looked at the equation carefully. The problem was not unsolvable, but it was clearly designed to be intimidating. He recognized the professor's strategy, a common one on battlefields and in boardrooms alike: create an impossible situation, force a retreat, establish dominance. With a calm that came from years of making decisions under far more dangerous pressure, Ibrahim stood and walked to the front of the room. He could feel 60 pairs of eyes following him, the collective assumption of his imminent humiliation hanging heavy in the air. At the board, he took the chalk from Harrington's outstretched hand. The professor stepped back, arms folded across his chest, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ibrahim studied the equation once more, now seeing all its complexities up close. Then, with methodical precision, he began to write. First, he reordered the equation, grouping terms differently than they appeared in the original formulation. Next, he introduced a substitution variable that simplified the expression considerably. As his chalk moved across the board, the familiar rhythm of mathematics took over, the same rhythm that had guided him when calculating resource distribution for drought-stricken regions, when determining optimal positioning for infrastructure projects, when planning logistics for humanitarian operations. He worked in silence for nearly 5 minutes, his handwriting neat and precise. When he reached what appeared to be an impasse, he paused, considering the problem from a different angle. Then he wrote a series of steps that transformed the equation using a technique commonly employed in ballistics calculations, a practical application that wasn't in textbooks, but emerged from necessity in field operations. The final solution emerged, elegant in its simplicity despite the complexity of the initial problem. Ibrahim underlined it twice, then stepped back from the board. The silence in the room had transformed from anticipatory to stunned. Harrington's satisfied smile had disappeared, replaced by a furrowed brow as he scrutinized Ibrahim's work, clearly searching for errors. "This approach," Ibrahim explained quietly, combines standard differential modeling with a practical method we use for resource allocation under variable conditions. The mathematics is essentially the same, though the applications differ. Professor, Harrington cleared his throat. You've used an unorthodox approach. Yes, Ibrahim acknowledged. In the field, we often lack the luxury of conventional solutions. We adapt. A student in the front row, a young man who always sat directly in front of Harrington and asked technical questions, raised his hand tentatively. Professor, I think... He's correct. The solution checks out. Harrington's jaw tightened. He turned to the board, examining Ibrahim's work more carefully. After a long moment, he nodded once, curtly. The solution is adequate, though the approach is unconventional. He turned to the class. This demonstrates that there are multiple valid paths to mathematical solutions, though I would expect you all to follow the methods we've covered in this course. Ibrahim handed the chalk back to Harrington. Thank you for the opportunity, Professor. As he returned to his seat, Ibrahim noticed the changed expressions on the students' faces, curiosity, reassessment, and in some cases, barely concealed admiration. Aisha gave him a small thumbs up as he sat down. Harrington, visibly unsettled, resumed his lecture, but the dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. The following morning, whispers preceded Ibrahim through the corridors of the mathematics building. Students from other classes nodded respectfully as he passed, some smiling in recognition, though he had never met them. News of the exchange with Professor Harrington had spread rapidly through the mathematics department and beyond. Ibrahim found this attention uncomfortable. In his position as a military officer and later as a diplomat, he had learned the value of quiet competence over public display. The previous day's demonstration had not been about proving his intelligence. It had simply been the most efficient way to diffuse a situation designed to embarrass him. As he approached the lecture hall, Aisha was waiting outside, accompanied by a small group of students. Major Traoré, she greeted him with a smile. We wanted to apologize for Professor Harrington's behavior yesterday. No apology necessary, Ibrahim assured her. It was a valuable exchange. A young man stepped forward, the one who had confirmed his solution. I'm Jason. I'm doing my thesis on applied mathematics in disaster management. After seeing your approach yesterday, I was wondering if you might have time to discuss some of the practical applications you mentioned. Before Ibrahim could respond, the door to the lecture hall opened and Professor Harrington emerged. The students fell silent immediately. Harrington paused when he saw the gathering, his gaze moving from the students to Ibrahim. Major Traoré, he said stiffly, a word in my office if you have a moment. The students exchanged glances. Aisha raised an eyebrow at Ibrahim, a silent question about whether he wanted their support. He gave a small shake of his head and nodded to Harrington. Of course, Professor. Harrington's office reflected the man himself, meticulously organized, traditional, with walls lined with mathematics texts and framed diplomas. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. Your solution yesterday, Harrington began without preamble, was unexpected. Ibrahim remained silent, waiting. Where did you study mathematics? Harrington asked, leaning back in his chair. I began at the University of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim replied. I studied geosciences, which required extensive mathematical training. Later, I continued my education while serving in various capacities: engineering corps, logistics, strategic planning. Harrington's fingers drummed on his desk. The approach you used, applying variable substitution in that particular way, is not common in academic settings. In the field, we often face problems without clear textbook solutions, Ibrahim explained. When calculating resource distribution during drought periods or planning infrastructure projects with limited materials, we adapt standard methods to our specific challenges. A long moment of silence stretched between them. Finally, Harrington spoke again, his tone different, less guarded, more genuine curiosity. Your technique reminded me of some work being done in computational modeling for climate systems, unorthodox, but effective. He hesitated. I may have misjudged both you and the nature of your mathematical background. It was as close to an apology as the professor seemed capable of offering. Ibrahim acknowledged it with a nod. We all make assessments. Based on limited information, Professor. It is a human tendency. Harrington studied him thoughtfully. You know, we have a seminar series where visiting scholars discuss applications of mathematical principles in their respective fields. It occurs to me that our students might benefit from hearing about practical applications in environments quite different from their experience. The invitation was unexpected. Ibrahim considered it carefully before responding. If you believe it would be valuable to your students, I would be willing to participate. I do, Harrington said with a decisive nod. He stood extending his hand across the desk. Mathematics transcends borders, Major Traoré. Sometimes I forget that fundamental truth. As they shook hands, Ibrahim recognized something in the professor's eyes, not quite friendship, but the beginning of respect. It was a small victory, but in his experience, such small victories often led to more significant change. Outside the office, Aisha and several other students were waiting, poorly disguising their curiosity. Everything okay? Aisha asked. Ibrahim nodded. Professor Harrington has invited me to give a seminar on practical applications of mathematics in field operations. Jason's face lit up. That's unprecedented. Harrington never brings in outside speakers for his advanced sections. Will you do it? Another student asked. Ibrahim smiled slightly. Yes, I believe there is value in sharing different perspectives. As they walked together toward the lecture hall, Ibrahim reflected on how differently this exchange was unfolding from what he had anticipated when he arrived at Westbrook. He had come expecting to learn about American educational and leadership models, yet here he was, preparing to teach. The irony was not lost on him. The mathematics department's largest lecture hall was filled beyond capacity. Students sat in the aisles, stood along the walls, some even peered in from the corridor. Word had spread beyond the mathematics department, engineering students, physics majors, even a few social science graduates had come to hear the visiting military officer from Burkina Faso speak. At the back of the room, Ibrahim noticed several faculty members, including the department chair and representatives from the International Relations Program. Alicia Dawson stood near the door, looking both surprised and pleased at the turnout. Professor Harrington stepped to the podium, clearing his throat to silence the murmuring crowd. Today's special seminar features Major Ibrahim Traoré, currently participating in our International Leadership Exchange Program. Major Traoré will discuss practical applications of advanced mathematics in field operations, resource management, and infrastructure development. Harrington paused, then added something clearly unplanned. I have had the privilege of witnessing Major Traoré's problem-solving approach firsthand, and I believe we all have much to learn from his perspective. Mathematics is universal, but the contexts in which we apply it are wonderfully diverse. The acknowledgement, public and genuine, reflected the transformation that had occurred in the week since their confrontation. As Harrington stepped aside, yielding the podium to Ibrahim, there was respect in his nod. Ibrahim moved to the front of the room, suddenly aware of the weight of expectation in the packed hall. He had prepared carefully, creating slides that showed the practical applications of mathematical principles in contexts far removed from the comfortable classrooms of Westbrook: water resource allocation during droughts, optimizing medical, supply distribution with limited transportation resources, calculating structural integrity for rapidly deployed infrastructure. Thank you, Professor Harrington, and thank you all for your interest, he began. I am not an academic by profession. I am a problem solver by necessity. For the next hour, Ibrahim walked them through case studies from his experience, situations where mathematical models had to be adapted to harsh realities, where elegant theoretical solutions confronted the constraints of limited resources and urgent needs. He showed them how differential equations similar to those they studied in class had helped determine where to drill wells in regions with declining water tables, how statistical models predicted crop failures in time to reallocate resources, how geometric calculations improved the efficiency of solar panel placement in remote villages. Throughout his presentation, Ibrahim emphasized a central theme. Mathematics does not exist in abstraction alone. It lives in the world, in the challenges we face, in the solutions we create when theory meets necessity. The students were rapt, asking questions that revealed both their technical intelligence and their growing awareness of how privileged their educational environment truly was. One student asked about technology limitations in field operations. Another wondered how language barriers affected the communication of mathematical concepts across different regions. As the formal presentation concluded, Ibrahim noticed something unexpected. Professor Harrington was taking notes, detailed, thoughtful notes, on the methodologies Ibrahim had described. The question and answer session extended well beyond the scheduled time. Eventually, Alicia had to intervene, reminding everyone that other classes needed the lecture hall. As students reluctantly began to disperse, many approached Ibrahim personally, asking follow-up questions or simply thanking him. Jason, the student working on disaster management, caught up with Ibrahim as he gathered his materials. Major Traoré, what you described today, adapting theoretical models to real-world constraints, is exactly what I'm trying to incorporate into my thesis. Would it be possible to continue this conversation? Before Ibrahim could answer, Professor Harrington approached. Jason is one of our most promising students, he said. His work on predictive modeling for natural disasters shows considerable potential. Ibrahim nodded. I would be happy to discuss this further. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow. As they arranged, Aisha joined them, accompanied by 2 other students. We were thinking, she said, that this shouldn't be just a one-time event. What if we organized an ongoing working group, connecting the theoretical work we're doing here with practical applications in different global contexts? Harrington considered this, then nodded slowly. That has merit. We could formalize it as part of our department's outreach initiative. A bridge between theory and practice, Ibrahim suggested, between different ways of approaching the same mathematical truths. Exactly, Aisha agreed enthusiastically. And not just for mathematics, this could extend to engineering, computer science, even policy studies. As the conversation expanded to include others, faculty members, graduate students, program administrators, Ibrahim watched the spontaneous formation of connections that crossed disciplines, backgrounds, and assumptions. What had begun as an attempt at humiliation had transformed into something neither he nor Harrington could have predicted, a genuine exchange of knowledge and perspective. Later, as the autumn evening settled over the campus, Ibrahim walked with Alicia toward the guest housing where he was staying. You've made quite an impression, she observed. When we arranged for you to audit classes, we never expected anything like this. Ibrahim smiled slightly. Unexpected outcomes are often the most valuable. Professor Harrington has already submitted a proposal to the department chair to establish a formal exchange program with universities in West Africa, Alicia told him. He seems particularly interested in the University of Ouagadougou. Ibrahim raised an eyebrow. That is unexpected. People can change when their assumptions are challenged, Alicia said. Even Harvard-educated mathematics professors with more pride than sense. They reached the guest house, its windows warm with golden light against the deepening blue of evening. Ibrahim paused on the steps, looking back at the campus spread before him. The historic buildings, the students crossing the quad, the lights in laboratory windows where work continued into the night. You know, he said quietly, I came here believing I would learn about American methods and perspectives. I did not expect to become the teacher, Alicia smiled. The best exchanges work in both directions. As Ibrahim entered the building, his phone buzzed with a message, an email from Jason already sending questions about applying mathematical models to drought prediction in the Sahel. Another notification followed, an invitation from the engineering department to discuss infrastructure development in resource-constrained environments. Ibrahim had come to Westbrook University as an observer, an outsider. Yet in the span of 2 weeks, through an equation on a chalkboard and the bridges built afterward, he had found something unexpected, recognition not of his difference, but of the universal language they all shared, the elegant, practical poetry Of mathematics that transcended borders, backgrounds, and assumptions. In his simple room, Ibrahim opened his laptop and began composing responses, continuing the conversation that had begun with a challenge and evolved into something far more valuable, an exchange between equals, each with something important to teach the other.